Hello, and thank you for attending today's webinar. Today we have Beau Keyte, President, the Keyte Group and founding partner of LTG. Today's webinar is Finding a Path to Creating an Organization of Problem Solvers. Beau not only has experience in healthcare organizations, but he's also provided lean expertise in several other industries, including automotive, service, and administrative processes. His experience in healthcare includes primary care clinics, hospitals, and post-acute care organizations. He has helped them develop and teach self-sufficient thinking that challenges processes, improves organizational performance and alignment, and sustains culture change. He is a faculty member and instructor for curriculums at the Lean Enterprise Institute and Ohio State University. He is the co-author of a number of journal articles and publications, including The Complete Lean Enterprise and LEI's newest book, Perfecting Patient Journeys. Beau holds a BSc and MBA degrees from the University of Michigan, and it is my pleasure to introduce Beau Keyte now.
Great, thank you. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I don't believe I've spoken with an ASQ group before. If so, it's been a while, so it's nice to be here. I appreciate your energy and attention to this. I am going to talk a little bit about creating an organization of problem solvers, and you did hear a little bit about me. That's a great picture. But the whole premise of this really started several months ago when we were talking about putting a webinar together, and I mentioned a new book that came out. In fact, it's been out now for about a month. It's called Perfecting Patient Journeys. And although it is obviously focused on healthcare issues and both the healthcare industry, the reason I'm talking to a combined group today is that the content is universal. This is very much a frontline guide on how to get to where you want to go. And it's a pretty deep and broad, I guess, expose on the things to worry about and the things to help the frontline move both the work of the process and the management of the process forward. And it's way too much to talk about in just an hour. So what I've elected to do is to highlight 3 topics that don't get a lot of airtime in our profession, in our collective profession. If you think about what we typically do to help our organizations solve problems and improve performance, there are 3 things that we've seen recently that don't seem to be quite as ingrained as other things. And so this is what I want to talk about for the hour. The first is actually challenging our approach and putting on the table some innovative continuous improvement methods that might make sense. The second is engaging people through small reversible experiments, which might be a little different than how we now do it with creating solutions as opposed to experiments. And finally, engaging the organization through socialization. And what we found over the last several years is that all change has a combination of technical and social elements. And the technical elements are well known to the people on this phone call, and they are readily adapted, particularly on the shop floor of manufacturers. But once you get off the shop floor of manufacturers, either into their office or into any service industry, we find that the social elements of change are very important and typically outweigh the technical or the tools portion. So we want to be able to focus on the social piece too, and I'll do that in the last third of the presentation. So to start the discussion and challenging our approach, I would like to first talk about what we've seen in terms of the default positions that many organizations go through in problem solving. The first is a combination of blanket solutions and best practices. And I know that the folks here are a combination of manufacturing and healthcare folks on the line. The best practices, or the blanket solutions rather, in manufacturing might be seen as we go and tour some really cool companies in the AME or the ASQ conferences and have some really great tours, or maybe even head over to Japan and see some good stuff. We come back and we get all excited because someone has figured out how to work really, really well. And we like to incorporate that into our organization. On the healthcare side, there's an entire industry created to research the best clinical methods to provide healthcare. And they do great research, and they publish great best practices, and they assume that if everyone just does these, life will be better. But both of these instances, blanket solutions and best practices, is kind of a one-size-fits-all mentality. And it doesn't matter how big or how complex or how small your organization is, the assumption is that blanket solutions on best practices work everywhere, when the reality is they don't. The context, the culture, the point of the transformation path you are on right now all go into figuring out what problems you have, not what blanket solutions to or best practices to incorporate without even thinking about it. Next, the boss-subordinate interactions. This is, I'm sure we've all been in this situation somewhere in our career, where our boss runs into our office, our cubicle, very, very excited, and says, "Hey, I just had a great lunch with a buddy of mine, or I just got off the golf course, I just read a great book. I'm all excited about this very specific solution that I just read about and heard about. I'd like you to take that on and incorporate inside the organization," and he or she runs out of your cubicle or office. And you're left there wondering what the heck just happened. I'm not sure what they were talking about. I don't know if it's going to fit, and I have no idea how to be responsible for this, but I'm on the hook. So that's another default position. The third one is including some of the best, well-meaning people in your organization, some of the smartest, some of the most passionate. We call them the A-team. Those are the guys you always turn to when you have something to improve. And while their thinking is very, very important, what's missing is everybody else's thinking. So as the A-team continues to be triggered to solve the problems, we find that the rest of the organization is wondering why their thinking never gets on the table, and the fact is that they may have a different view of reality than the A-team. So the A-team may be solving the wrong problems or thinking about it in a less robust manner. The last one, expert problem solvers, is actually a slight deviation from the A-team. The A-team actually has the folks picked for improving the performance embedded inside of the work process that's being improved. The expert problem solvers are not. The expert problem solvers parachute in or show up either from corporate or external consultants, and they do a great job. They're really smart people. They do a great job analyzing all sorts of data, stuff that people may or may not have access to. They then create a perfect solution or near perfect solution and hand it over to the folks living with these problems and leave. And as they leave, the people watching them saying, they may not even know their names, but they certainly didn't know much of the thinking and the context of the problems they were living in. And the folks living inside those processes, which are now supposed to be redesigned, don't understand the thinking or the context or the reality of the expert problem solvers and what they saw. So typically what happens is not much. So that's the default position we see. And as a result of that, what do we typically run into? The first bullet point here is basically redefining the old definition of insanity. We keep on running down the same methodology, hoping against hope that we're going to be able to be better at solving the problem this time. We're stuck on the traditional approaches. Many of us slide into solution-based improvements. Each one of us have been trained to think about solutions, but we haven't been trained well to think about the problems these solutions are supposed to solve and whether or not the solution is appropriate. We also find that in every case, including the A-team, there's minimal frontline ownership. Even with the A-team, it's just the A-team that owns it, and no one else does. And so there's not a lot of buy-in as a result from the people who have to actually change the work and think differently about how to approach the work. And most of all, the biggest kicker to me is that we focus on the technical portion of the process, but we don't focus on the management system that controls the process and leads the process. And from our perspective, the management system and the work process are linked. They're connected. In combination, they give you the outcomes you now have. And if you disconnect them and say, well, we're going to keep the management system the same, but we're going to move the work process forward and act differently and work differently, then you basically have two choices. You now have a disconnect. You have a conflict between how you manage and how you work. And you could either move the management system forward to be in alignment of the new work process, or you can basically start the clock ticking and see how long it takes for the work process to shift back to the same way we always used to do it, because they have to align up with the management system one way or another. So alternate 2 is just drifting back to the way things always were. If the argument that I put on the table, or the discussion, the one-way discussion that I just had with you, seems to have some traction, or some reality with you, then what we need to be able to do is use PDCA on the methods of continuous improvement and change the improvement. And this was our personal challenge in 2009 when we were asked to help the entire state of Michigan improve patient flow inside their emergency departments. We worked with 70 hospitals simultaneously, and it was very clear at that point that our paradigm on how to help facilitate people learning was not going to work. So we tried a very different collaborative model where we didn't have to have people on site everywhere. We could work within a budget, and we had enough bandwidth to support 70 hospitals at once. And in 2010, we basically created a way for people to divide up the 70 hospitals into smaller regions. We had 9 regions total. And we went from region to region with a very different model of helping people learn. And this is what it looked like a little bit. First of all, we started out with a hypothesis that said a continuous improvement, just a second here. A continuous improvement culture can be initiated by a few frontline staff members leading a process problem-solving project inside the emergency room based on fundamental principles of lean thinking inside the emergency room. And we didn't have a huge training budget or extensive use of consultants. We weren't on site. It did, however, require a few key individuals from each hospital to learn how to lead, engage, and champion. So we needed a few key people to show up for us to work with. And it did have some intensive skill building, but not through conventional training. So this was our paradigm shift. And I'll talk a little bit about that briefly, just for the my screen is not shifting. Here we go. Just inside healthcare, and then I'll do one for manufacturing. We set it up so the hospitals could pick whatever problem they wanted inside patient flow. So it had to be something to do with patient flow inside the ED. And once they picked it, we would go to a region, and 6 or 10 hospital teams of 3 people would show up, and we'd teach them something. We'd teach them, in this case, because it was a flow issue, we would go down a value stream improvement project, visual management, problem solving, experiments, things like that. And we teach them in such a way that they drafted something from what we taught. So they learned a little bit and drafted something, and then shared it amongst the teams of the different hospitals on site, and then went home. When they went home, they took the information they had started. They did not consider it finished. Whatever deliverable they had was only in draft form, because their assignment was to take back a draft and engage the rest of the emergency room in thinking. So what the rest of the groups might understand that they don't, the other shifts or the other people, and they could actually use this as a socialization effort to get a lot of information on the table and then come to a decision on what should be happening within the context of their organization, as opposed to just being the A team. So that actually that went on for about 9 months. Very, very good results in general. And that made us think very differently about the core elements that we needed for other collaborative methods, because our assumption was the next collaborative would not be the same, because it would be a different situation. And instead of having people assume that they have to act like we want them to act, we wanted to meet them where they were. And so we're developing collaborative now on the basis of where the client is, not where we are. But we do have some fundamental tenets you see on this slide. First of all, that the coaches, not us, but the client coaches, work with teams and with each other. So they coach teams and they share with other coaches how the coaching is going. And as a result, you get some good coaching development. The teams work on specific problems and share the efforts with other teams. Two ways. They share it within, in this case, it'd be within the ED, all the shifts, all the docs, things like that. And they'd also come back and share with the other hospitals in terms of what they're learning, what they're struggling with, what seems to work, what doesn't seem to work, and why. And last but not least, if you visualize an accordion that's all closed up, this is how we would typically train to have everything inside this closed up batch for several days, and we release the teams. Now we've stretched the accordion out. So we've actually given time in between these teaching points to have people think about it, have it simmer a little bit, have them be able to digest it, maybe take a little bit of data, make sure they reach out to people. So we have a cadenced approach with a little bit of training, and then go back, socialize it, work it through, and then come back and tell us what you've learned. So it's a very different model, and I did describe one for the ED. I also want to describe one in industry. This was a little bit different because instead of a flow problem, they had other specific issues for very deliberate problem breakdown for things like setup issues. This was in a vegetable packing plant. So they had setup issues, they had kitchen issues where the yield was low, they had bottles that were falling off in different places in the fast packaging thing. So they had very specific defects they wanted to address. And they also had an organization that prided themselves in hiring people who were very much into command and control. So the entire staff of all the plants were very much into command and control. So this took, once again, a different tact. But the tenets were all there. We first looked at us as the external lean coach or the expert. This could be you. In this case, it was an external consultant, but it could be an internal consultant too, where we oversaw the overall effort. We taught and facilitated the coaches. And then the internal coaches did something different. Because they had such an issue with command and control, we actually had them tag team each other as they coached teams. And they coached people who reported to them as opposed to somebody else's department. So if I was in charge of a very specific team, I would be coaching them, and if Catherine was my tag coach, she would be observing me. And at the end of the coaching thing, Catherine and I would talk about what just happened, and we learned from each other. And same thing, if it was Catherine's team, I'd be observing her. At the end, we'd go back and forth in terms of what we saw, maybe better ways to address it, etc. So they were able to really leverage their internal knowledge without me being around. And that was a good thing. It was highly leveraged. The improvement teams, in this case, had one per location, one for each plant, and a coach aligned to them. And we also spent time coaching vertically up and down the ladder, including with plant managers who were also being coached to coach. So this was a very different way of looking at it. And we used, instead of a value stream mapping approach, we really used an A3 approach with very specific problem breakdown, kind of like on a containment issue. So if I can move on, it seems to be having problems moving. Okay, so that's in terms of the methods. That's what we're talking about in challenging the methods. So let's improve on continuous improvement. The second piece I want to talk about is the technical portion in terms of small reversible experiments. Now this might be a mouthful, or maybe it's very familiar to you, but what I'd like to see is an organization become scientists. And if you think about a scientist, my wife spent much of her career being a research chemist. If she wanted to create a new compound, her assumption was she would never get it the first time out. Her assumption was she would have to experiment her way to that compound because they never had made that compound before. So the odds of hitting it the first time is nil. And that's very similar to what we see in the changes that we make. We've never tried these changes before. What makes you think it would work? So instead of just assuming they're going to work, let's think about it differently. Let's think about it very scientifically in terms of how we would approach it from an experimental basis and experiment our way to the future state. So we can do that within the process, we can do that within the management of the process, and we focus on quick cycles of learning. So these aren't month-long experiments. They might be as short as 2 hours. or maybe just for one shift, or for a day. And the focus is not on implementing solutions. It's about learning what's really going on so we can learn our way to a solution. So why small and why reversible? We frame the solutions as hypotheses. In other words, since we've never done it before, what makes you think it'll work now? So it's just going to be a hypothesis about the cause in the experiments. We want to prevent the blanket solution, so we want to make it very small. We want to make it small because we can unplug it. And a reversible, we can make it small so we can learn quickly. And we make it reversible so that if we find something that's going wrong, it's either adverse reactions to a piece of machinery or a customer or a patient, we can pull back immediately and say, listen, that's not working, let's rethink it. It's not working the way we want. But if we do so, we can encourage investigation of what's really going on. And we can also find out that the complex problems we now face in our organizations probably have multiple causes. So we can do experiments to find out which causes there really are there, which ones we just think are there but aren't really. So, oh, please, this is not moving. Catherine, do you see the same slide?
I can see it. It looks like there's a little, might be delayed, the PowerPoint, because it looks like it's misaligned a little bit.
Oh. How about that?
Yes, clearly. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we're having technical problems all over the place. So if we look at the PDCA cycle a little bit differently, what we actually see is in the do phase, we're running lots and lots of small experiments. And two things happen when you start doing that. First of all, you aren't assuming that you're always going to get it right. In fact, you're assuming you're going to learn your way to get it right. And the other thing is you use lots and lots of people to do this. You actually engage more than the A team. As you run lots of experiments, you can have other people play in that role. So what we mean by running experiments is basically running a learning cycle, or PDCA. So we develop a theory or a hypothesis about what you would expect to happen, and then figure out a way to test it. There are different ways to test it. What way should you do it? Then you run it, and you look, and you measure. You take a look at the results, not just from the technical standpoint of whether or not the performance improved, but also the social standpoint of what the people inside that experiment were feeling, what they think you might have missed, what's really going on here, so you can analyze the results. And then at the end, you have a choice. If you met your mark, you can keep it. You've confirmed your theory. Or if you haven't met your mark, you can reject it and modify it and run another experiment. Now, we have examples of experiments. I can share a few with you if we have the time. Given our technical nature, we may or may not have the time. But as you plan your experiment, it's all about who, what, when, where, and how. So who is going to try out the change? Is it just one shift? Is it just the people up front? Is it only one set of customer contact people? Who's going to try it out? Is it one plant, one facility? What's going on? What specifically are they going to do? Here's where the rubber meets the road. Because if we're going to be scientists, we have to be very deliberate about what they're going to do. It is a new standard work. And we have to be able to be compliant with that standard work during the course of the experiment so we understand if that new way works or not. So we write it down. What exactly are we going to do? When are we going to do it? If you're worried about risk, you might find a time when there's less demand. Either less work going on, for the ED was in the evenings or the late night when they want to try out something new. They try it when there weren't a lot of patients around and kind of use that to shake down the process. And then how many times? Do you want to just do it once? Do you want to do it once per line? Do you want to progress it? So you keep on stretching the system each time. You do it a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, until you basically cover all your bases, all your shifts, all your facilities, etc. Where are you going to do it? And most importantly, how will you know if it made a difference? So we may not have standard work when we start. We're going to create standard work for the experiment, but we definitely need baseline information in terms of the performance you want to improve. Where are you now? so you know whether or not the new experiment actually did anything. We can experiment within the work. We can experiment within the management of the work. I had a conversation probably about 3 weeks ago with a CEO who was very frustrated about his organization because he said, we're all managing by committee. I can't stand this anymore. We don't seem to be doing the same things right. We manage inside a conference room in committees. And all of a sudden, we were talking about what experiments they should run to not do that. First of all, what problem is he trying to solve? How would he measure whether or not doing it differently will make a difference? Does he have to worry about all committees or just a few? So we actually sat down and tried to think through what actual experiments are we going to run to manage differently. And then within the process of continuous improvement, I was talking with a guy, a master black belt, who worked for a Fortune 50 company that basically was one of the companies that put Six Sigma on the map. And he came up to me and said, you know, this really makes a lot of sense. It seems like we engage more people. My problem is I run a department of people, and everyone in our department facilitates 5-day Kaizen somewhere inside the company. That's our job. So I don't know what to do. And so we started talking about how would you start to unwind that to learn if 5-day Kaizens work as effectively as shorter, excuse me, shorter, more rapid experiments. And he had to develop experiments about how to change the methods and be able to test whether or not that made sense. So I started out the hour rather, talking about the adaptability of organizations and how to create an organization of problem solvers. Here's a pyramid, if you will, excuse me, where we recognize different levels of an organization. Each one has problems to solve, and they aren't the same. They're all different kinds of problems. So within each level, if they worry about how to solve the problems that they see, whether they're management problems, technical problems, or strategic problems, if they start to run experiments, then as a community of problem solvers inside that organization, we're much more capable of adapting to the changes as they come down the pipe that we don't even know about yet. Let's see. I realize we've lost some time because of technical difficulties. Catherine, maybe just 1 or 2 questions, and we can move on to the next one. Is there anything there that you'd like to share with me?
Yes, there are no questions at this time. If anyone has any questions, there should be a question box in your control panel for the GoToWebinar. Please feel free to enter any now. Otherwise, we will also have a time at the end of the webinar for questions as well.
Okay. Well, since they haven't typed, I'd like to continue giving the time frame. So we talked a little bit about excuse me, changing methods and rapid experiments, or small reversible experiments, excuse me. And what I'd like to talk about now, if I can get the screen to progress, is the social side. And I'll say this very clearly: the social side is the most difficult side to deal with. The technical side has been very easy on the shop floor for those of us who came up through manufacturing. The social side is incredibly difficult when we get into the service industries, any service industry, or the office of the manufacturers. So engaging the organization takes a different flavor. And what we want to focus on is socialization. Now, I was at the Lean Enterprise Institute Summit, the annual summit last week, and we were taking a task when we talked about this because they said, socialization is nimble washing. Why don't you just talk about nimble washing? And from our perspective, people may not know what that term is. So instead of using vocabulary that is in a different language to begin with and might be confusing, what we'd like to do is talk about something that everyone understands, and you can talk about socialization. Socialization is basically a way of engaging people horizontally and vertically within your organization to get their thinking on the table. So we're able to communicate better, we're able to understand more about their reality versus our reality. We have the opportunity to hear others and to think about it and respond. If we have 10 people around a table, we're going to have 10 different definitions of a problem. So how do we connect with these people to make sure that we understand how everyone's thinking, and that might provide a very different focus than just the A team or just the expert problem solver out there trying to understand what's going on. So We want to be able to understand and discuss what the problem is with others, the nature of the problem, the importance of the problems, methods of testing. Uh, is this a flow issue or a containment issue? Should we worry about A3s or value stream maps? How should we really approach this? What are the new roles and responsibilities of this? And it just isn't that easy, but it is critical in terms of being able to get everyone thinking about solving problems and being scientists. So we're not trying to build consensus here. We're really trying to present evidence. We're trying to ask for their thinking, not, this is my idea, what do you think? It's, here's the problem we're trying to address, what do you think about it? It's a very open conversation because they have different realities than we do. So we worry about confirming assumptions and data. We worry about looking at risks. I was in a situation at a hospital in January where they designed kind of a cool experiment. And when they went out to talk to the other folks involved in it, the first thing they ran into were two very specific things that would create massive risk if they didn't address it first. So they needed to take those two pieces and deal with it, and then they could run experiments. So it actually uncovered hidden risks. And so we talk about lots of stuff. We talk about the need for change, the problems, the roles. We talk about basically everything along the way. And if you think about that expanded accordion again, to give people time to talk about the different phases of problem solving or the different phases of redesigning work or value streams or management systems or whatever, you have the opportunity to reach out to people and engage them. So we look at ideas generated, we look at ideas and plans for experiment, we look at results of experiments. So if we're going to run one, how do we tell people what happened? And if we run small ones and we socialize them, maybe we can engage more people in the experiments, not just the A team. Maybe we can engage others in this when we go through the process. So I wanted to touch briefly on maybe some methods. The biggest thing we discovered when we were running down this new path of ours is that there was a need to connect the formal and informal communication methods within the company. And I'm sure everyone in your organization knows your grapevine and your informal method of getting the word out. Everybody has one. And we needed to tap that and then connect it with the formal piece. So if you want to engage everyone, how do you get the word out? So although the first bullet point, agenda items for regularly scheduled meetings, well, that's great, but not everybody attends the meetings. So how would you create a pool for those meetings, and how would you somehow get the word through the grapevine that something cool is going on, there's some experiments going on, maybe we ought to stand up and participate and let them know what we're thinking, and then have that as a pull towards the socialization. Huddles are great. We've seen them in manufacturing, we've seen them in healthcare, but it's not just for basically shift information. It's also for problem solving. What are we understanding about what went wrong the last shift or the last day? And how are we using that to maybe gather data for an experiment? So that's a very social piece. Key person assignments is probably something you've used before. We have very specific assignments to have people run out with a list of people they have to contact and let them know what's going on. Food and fun takes a couple of different twists. What I found is that healthcare has a lot more it's a lot more creative in socializing than the other industries. I give them a lot of credit. One organization had Suck It Up Wednesdays. So Suck It Up Wednesdays, they knew when it was Wednesday that experiments will probably be running in their area. So they spent a Wednesday experimenting, and then they spent Thursday and Friday talking about it, Monday, Tuesday maybe revising it, and then by the time Wednesday came around, they all sucked it up and ran another experiment. So it was very focused. Other folks had some type of casino night where they decided to have everyone in and have some games, but use it as an opportunity to talk about what's going on, what the thinking is with the current problems they're solving, where they are in progressing towards down that project, and getting feedback on it. And finally, I think most of us probably use some type of visual tools or dashboard or whatever, and what we found useful is to have a piece of that carved out for the experiments that we're running asking for feedback, or maybe participation, or maybe talking about or summarizing the results of the experiments, both technical and social, that have occurred over the last week or so. So that's just some ways of thinking about it. The last piece I want to talk about in socialization is, if you think it's important to go out and talk to people, and that it might make a difference if we talk to people and get their thinking, it's also important to close the loop. Because if you're talking to lots and lots of folks inside your organization, I'm guessing by the time you get to the last one, you'll be thinking a little bit differently than you were when you talked to the first one. And what you want to be able to do is go back to the people, everyone you've talked to, and let them know, first of all, what everyone has been thinking, and what you're choosing to do as a team, and why, based on the feedback that you've gotten through the socialization of the organization. That's all I had for this piece of it, although I do have some things, some ways to get some more information. But I'd like to take some questions and answers now, if you have some, Catherine.
We do. We have some questions regarding, do you address incentives, and how have you incentivized people to participate?
We have not addressed incentives. And I don't know if you mean monetary or not. Monetary we have not addressed. I would think about incentives from a different angle. Actually asking their opinion and having them asking if they want to participate and play in that sandbox, and it is really helpful. People want to be acknowledged. People want to be heard. People want to understand that their reality is on the table too. And what we found is that there could be some initial pushback on running experiments, but once they get into the groove of actually trying stuff and talking about it, getting excited because their life is getting easier, you usually don't need to provide any other kind of incentive to move forward.
Okay, great.
Good question, though.
Thank you. Kind of along the same lines as that area, or that, how do you free up people to have time to work on experiments when everyone is so busy with their daily work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a couple of thoughts on that, and I don't think I'll get through all of them, but I would talk about a couple things. First of all, if you start small with small experiments, it won't take a lot of time. It takes some thinking time. Excuse me. But if your focus is on experiments that actually free up capacity and take some of the pain out of the rework or the waste or whatever people have to live with every day, then you free up some capacity to move forward. So that's doing it at a grassroots level. That being said, when we worked with the hospitals across Michigan, we saw a distinction in how the teams were working that correlated back to whether or not the leadership saw enough value in these projects to dedicate time. And I would suggest that finding time is a problem the leaders should be solving, not the people in the front lines. So what's your experiment to tap into the leaders saying, you know, is it okay if we just take X minutes or X hours a week and try something? If we fail, fine, but this is our experiment in trying to actually dedicate some time so people can do their regular work and not feel like they have two jobs. They just have one job.
Great. We have a question regarding the execution of experiments. How can small reversible experiments be done on a controlled process that requires verification before putting a change in place, and once the change is in place, requires training everyone on the change?
That doesn't sound like an experiment. That sounds like a process change. So I understand what you're saying. There's lots of stuff like that. And I would challenge you to say, what are the boundaries of exactly what a process change is or isn't? What problem are you trying to solve? And so two things. You could actually find things that may not need that process change. So maybe it's not small enough yet to learn. Or you need to engage the right people to get permission to make some changes. And in terms of training everyone is not the answer. If it's going to be an experiment that runs for one shift, and the other shifts aren't even involved. So this goes back to how you would start to engage people inside your organization to think differently about change and the fact that everyone has to be on board. Well, that's assuming that the change works. We're not assuming that change is going to work. We're assuming we have to learn something. So how can we set it up so that everybody, so we do some learning before we formalize a process change, which is learning our way to a process change. And I guess the challenge is to go back to those who hold the reins on that policy and say, listen, there may be a better way of doing it. Is it worth trying to do? And how would we do that so we don't put the organization or our customers at risk?
Great, thank you. We have another question regarding, would you recommend, are experiments best handled in smaller groups?
I'm thinking. The audio is still live here. I believe, it's been my experience, that if you start small, it's fine. But let me give you an example of one where they started small and expanded quickly. The University of Michigan Health System wanted to try something different inside the emergency department. They would radically alter the patient flow back to the examination room. And they believed that they could put the patient at risk, and they also believed that the docs and the nurses and the MAs weren't playing well together. So they didn't want to blow the whole place up. And they started for a 2-hour, they started very small. They did a 2-hour window of an experiment with a different standard work from 2 to 4 p.m. in the morning, which is very low volume. And they learned from it. And then they started running it at night for 4 hours. Then they decided to change it to the morning, maybe not the heaviest morning, but a morning that was relatively light for 2 and 4 and 6 hours. And they tried it. Then they tried a really heavy time, and then they ran it for a week. Each time they did it, they involved different people, and it was a bigger team. So they started small, and by the time they were done, I'm betting they had about 50% of the organization actually involved in the experiment before they made a true change, before they decided what they really wanted to do. And they had a big opportunity for kind of getting a lot of input. They made a lot of adjustments. They made it right for the organization. So I have no problem starting small. But if you think about it in terms of progressing, the more you progress, the more you engage other people, and that's a great thing to do because now they can play scientist too.
Great. What was the most universally useful tool you found to be accepted and embraced by the masses? I don't know.
I like the question. I'm not sure how to answer it. To be embraced by the masses, it's not a technical tool, it's a social tool. The thing they liked the most was being included, being acknowledged, being listened to, and then getting feedback from it. And that's the key. From a technical standpoint, I think the visual management was probably the most intriguing to them because it was the spot where huddles and problem solving and engagement occurred. So I guess from the technical side, it's the visual management board, but what they really got out of it was not the board, it was the conversation around the board and socialization.
Okay, thank you. We do have some more questions regarding socialization. Let's see here. Can you share examples of how to bring participants who are maybe not on board or resistant to change, how to get them to participate and socialize the change with the experiments?
I can share a couple. We're at a pretty famous healthcare institution, and there was one doc who would literally turn around and walk away from us whenever he saw us in the hallway. And when we finally got a chance to go over and ask him why he was running away from us, he said he was very frustrated, he was very unhappy with the whole organization, he wasn't happy about anything. And it came down to a very specific problem that he had, and that was chasing lab results. And he was so frustrated about it he could scream. So we worked with him and said, listen, if if we can include you and your thinking in improving the turnaround time from lab, would you be interested in playing in this experiment? And would you help us beyond labs? And he said, absolutely. Because we found out what was bothering him and invited him to help the problem. So that's kind of a one-off thing. But in general, um, as a group, you always have folks in the organization who are more resistant to others. That'll be forever. And the way we've gotten them on board is to ask them if they want to play. And if they don't want to play, we start piloting or experimenting with others. And the other people are usually learning something and life is improving. And so the people who are resistant are kind of looking over the walls thinking, wow, that's kind of weird. It seems like be having more fun or learning something and life seems to be improving. And most of them tend to get on board at that point. So if you think about it in terms of a pull instead of a push, you start, if they don't want to play, fine. They will probably want to play. If you're serious about doing this, and if you're serious about expanding who plays in experiments, who participates, they'll eventually want to play, at least most of them.
So it sounds like that's one of the methods that you use to mitigate groupthink in the socialization process. Are there other examples that you have or other thoughts regarding about how to control groupthink in a negative connotation?
Well, I'll give you maybe a different way of thinking about it. And the resistors, or people, they don't have to be resistors, but they could just be people with different opinions. And they could see their reality very differently from others, and they might be right. But I would encourage you at that point to actually say, well, listen, you have some good ideas. Maybe we can run an experiment focused on solving those problems with your ideas, and in parallel run a different one. So if we set them up right, then we can figure out which one seems to be working and why. So you are acknowledging and pulling towards them in terms of what seems to make sense from their perspective, but you're being very deliberate saying, we'll do that, but we're going to see whether or not it's better, just as we are this other experiment that other people want to try. So it's about finding ways to engage them, finding ways to acknowledge where they are, and then finding ways to have them figure out is moving in their direction better or worse. But I'm not sure if I'm answering the question right, Catherine. Are there other variations that I should be addressing?
Nope, I think that answers it very well.
Okay.
We do have some more questions. I know we're running to the top of the hour. We will continue to answer questions, and this webinar again will be recorded, but Beau and I will continue going through the questions. And feel free to drop off if you need to.
For those who are dropping off, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
We do have some more questions regarding socialization. What is your perspective, and do you believe that each stakeholder is at a different emotional intelligence level?
Well, I think everybody's at a different level for everything. I have been completely surprised at how I thought a simple problem was viewed differently by nearly everyone. And that's what makes socialization so critical. They're all at different points. They all have different perspectives and different experiences, which makes them read this problem differently. And so I walk into a situation assuming that everyone's going to have a slightly different view about what's going on, and the challenge is how to get them together as a group to figure out the best way we should begin, or the best couple ways we should begin.
I had a specific question come in regarding socialization tools. Would you suggest lunch and learns as a good tool to socialize and also learn about problems?
Yeah, that's kind of the food and fun slide I had a while back. Lunch and learns are fine, but I like them a lot. So that's the short answer. I want to be very specific though what happens in lunch and learns, and that there is a way to put problems on the table and facilitate the feedback. But I think those are great opportunities.
Great. What kind of informal training, like such as topics or tools, would you recommend to help teams get started thinking as problem solvers?
a very small experiment that they learned from. And I'll give you an example. We were working with a primary care clinic up here in Michigan, and it was, I call it a two-doc shop. There were two physicians, so it's a pretty small clinic. And they were frustrated because they were always going home too late. They wanted to go home on time. They wanted the whole staff to go home on time. Nobody was going home on time. So they had a hypothesis that said, you know, if we look at what we're spending time doing after hours, a lot of it's prescription refills. And we're doing them at the end of the day. And maybe if we think about doing those differently, we can go home on time. So they set up a very small experiment. They said, listen, we're going to measure whether or not we go home on time by what time we walk out the door. And the changes we're going to make is when we choose to write the refills. And so they tried it at different times of the day. They tried it after every patient visit. They tried it different ways until they learned a way to go home on time. And that was very visceral to them. It was very important. It was also very obvious. It was also very obvious when they succeeded. So I would try solving an experiment that creates pain and unnecessary pain, and having them think very deliberately about what they would try. And if you go back to the slide that says, how do you design one, I take the team through that and start learning.
One question is regarding motivation. The motivation of individuals being different from each other. How do you handle those situations?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's also going to be true forever. But I think the motivation to change goes back to whether or not this problem is important to solve, and can we agree on what the problem is and the importance of it to the organization. So if you're not just running around being a hammer looking for nails, and you're picking strategic things to solve, then the motivation may be different, but the intent is not, in terms of we're all trying to make this organization better so we have a job tomorrow, and so we have customers tomorrow, and we want to be able to play. And the fact that we don't all play at the same speed or with the same passion, that's not the problem to solve yet. We want to start to solve the problem of people not being scientists. So where would you start? And if you start with the fact that some may be more motivated than others, then start in the pool of motivated people, but don't leave the other ones out. Make sure they're engaged in understanding what we're doing, why we're doing it, asking them their thoughts, and if they have no thoughts, fine. Then keep on telling them and sharing with them the results of the experiment and how things are getting better, not just for the staff, but for the customers. So these are social issues. In fact, most of the questions so far have been social issues, not technical issues. And I would find ways that seem to make sense in terms of socializing inside your organization. And once again, this is a series of experiments. What experiments can you begin to start experiments in socialization? How would you know that it's better? What are you going to do differently? When are you going to do it? Who's going to do it? Where is it going to be done? How would you start to move in that direction if you believe that starting in that direction might have better outcomes?
We have a couple more questions. One being, there was a slide, level of concern, that a participant asked to have a little further explanation on.
Could you repeat that?
The level of concern slide.
Just a moment. Let me get a paper copy so I don't flip back through the slides. Level of concern. I apologize. That's not popping out.
Okay. I'm not sure which regard, so if that participant would like to clarify the question, I'd be happy to read it again.
Okay. But if that person can type in something more to trigger it, I'll be more than happy to respond.
Okay. A couple questions. They wanted to know, what was the timeline on your Michigan project?
Oh, that was 8 months. We tried it one one day a month to give people time for, they operate 24/7 in an ED, so they needed time to get to all the folks inside the organization. That being said, I wouldn't run it that long the next time. We learned a little bit more about a better cadence, and there's some touch points that we can do quicker and some we need to allow more time with. So that was a learning experiment for us too.
I do have some clarification. For the level of concern, it was the last slide on the Plan, Do, Check, Act.
The last slide on Plan, Do, Check, Act was let me show one more slide before we go, because we have about half the people dropped off. Just before I answer that, send me an email if you would like the tip sheets on running experiments, if you'd like an excerpt from the book, or any outstanding questions you may have. And we had about 250 people on the phone call, so I'll put out 3 copies that I can send for free. You have to pick a number between 1 and 365. The number represents a day of the year. It's a birthday of an extended family member of mine. If you hit or come close to that, you'll get a book. And my email address is down here. Since I'll leave that up here while I look for the slide. The last PDCA slide I showed, I'll get back to this in just a moment here. Let me flip up here. Was the PDCA with this major one with all the minor ones in the do piece. So, it's this one. I'm sorry. I was thinking about the major PDCA wheel. So, what was the question now, Catherine?
If you could just explain this a little bit more.
Yeah. So, in this slide, we recognize that everybody has problems to solve, and everyone has to do the right thinking at the right level to solve those problems. So you see down at the bottom, the front line has has problems all the time, has problems every hour, and they have to be able to solve those problems every hour, but they solve them, not the president. So the president is coming down saying, do this, do this, do this to solve your problems. The team is responsible for solving those problems. The next level up, the supervisors, the team leaders, your staff, they have other problems to solve that kind of feed from the bottom one. So they could be looking at trends. They could be looking at not achieving monthly targets. They could be looking at action plans. It's very different from the front line of doing the work. And as you keep on going further up in your organization, you have fewer problems to solve, but they're more important. So all the way at the top, the executives only have a few things to worry about, but they're really, really, really big. And down at the bottom of the pyramid, they have problems all the time, but they're smaller problems. So what we're showing here is a stratification of how to think about problem solving given the level of the organization.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. We're about 10 minutes past, so I guess we'll keep going on them if that's all right with you, Beau.
That's fine.
5 more minutes? Okay. Please provide guidance as far as how much frontline time staff per week should we be planning for dedicating to problem solving, and is there a minimum amount you suggest?
Well, the people who have been doing this for a while probably have 20% or more. I'm not suggesting you do that. I think it would be good if you found a way to think about Second Off Wednesday. They were still doing real work, but they were doing work differently every Wednesday. Excuse me, every Wednesday. So I don't have a great number for you. It really depends on where you want to start, not where you end up. I believe if you start somewhere, you're going to end up at a different point. You're going to realize that solving problems is just as important as doing the work. So you will probably end up spending more time once you understand the benefits of solving the problems. But just to give you an example, we had the teens in the hospital collaborative who were dedicating 1 day a week. That not everybody, but just the team, 1 day a week, did incredibly well. I'm not suggesting you find a day. I'm suggesting you figure out how much time you seem to need. The minimum for me, if if you're not spending, I don't know, I hate absolutes, but at a bare minimum, start with 4 hours a week with people who really need to think about this stuff, and that includes socialization time too. That's really, really small. I really believe you need a lot more, but you should be starting somewhere.
Okay, great. Just two more questions. One regarding technical aspects of training. So, for example, how do you teach technical tools to teams without becoming the expert? Or the regular use of statistical tools, there may be some limiting factors as far as who can adapt that technical lingo and also the usage of those tools.
Well, I would agree with that. Um, I don't. It's been my experience that the statistical side has a clear place in problem solving, but it doesn't make sense to train everybody on statistics. But so I wouldn't go down that path. In fact, I wouldn't make green belts of everybody personally, although you're more than welcome to disagree with me. I am concerned about having people think very deliberately about knowing whether or not something is different and being able to test that. There's simple data techniques you can go through. I mean, think about the short experiment on leaving the clinic on time. You don't need a lot of statistics to do that. You just write down what time you leave every night. So there are a lot of things you can do without massive statistical appreciation. And for those that do need that appreciation, then you need someone to help. For those, to me, few problems that are critical, if you need a true data expert to run, then have them be part of the team, but have the team see that person as a resource as opposed to vice versa. The team's driving the bus. The expert is on the bus. There's a difference.
And
did I answer both pieces of that question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Last question is the socialization process a type of asynchronous learning event, similar type of Kaizen learning event, I should say?
I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Is the socialization an asynchronous type of Kaizen?
Oh, what a cool question. I should give a free book just for that one. We actually did socialization as experiments. And in this collaborative, and in fact in every collaborative we have now, when we get back together as a team, the first thing we do is discuss our successes and failures in socialization since the last time we met, and we literally do a reflection and a PDCA on socialization. So we've embedded PDCA of socialization inside the collaborative, and it is incredibly important because the teams start to think differently about what seems to work and what doesn't work inside the context of the organization. So that's a great point that I didn't bring up before.
Great. Okay. Thank you. It looks like, I'm sorry, there is one more question. Is there any potential to use design of experiment tools in order to study multiple situations with a single experiment?
It could be, but I've actually had this question before. I think it's a great question. Design of experiments, I would challenge you a couple things. Most problems don't need that level of accuracy. So the opportunity to use it within the multitude of performance problems you have inside an organization, yeah, there are a few, but not a lot. And what you need to worry about in design of experiments is that what the purpose is. To me, at least when I was doing them more regularly, the design of experiments was to find the optimal solution. It wasn't necessary to learn anything. It was to find an optimal solution. And the person who did the thinking was typically not the person running the machine or living inside the process. It was the outside expert being parachuted in with all this really good technical knowledge. So if your purpose is to solve the problem to the optimal solution, and it's very complex, needs a lot of data, run after the DOE. But if your purpose is to engage everyone as scientists, I don't think it makes sense to train everybody on design experiments so they can design their own. And I don't think DOEs themselves are useful for most of the problems that we see in in performance. They're useful for some, and they're really, really great for some. But I would not suggest that universally as a way of thinking about the experiments. I worry about who's doing the thinking, and is it really appropriate for these types of problems to design experiments. If you worry about going home on time at 5, you need a DOE to do that, or you can just start doing something tomorrow and testing things out.
And that concludes the questions that I had. Thank you very much, Beau, for staying on the line, and thank you for everyone for your participation. And again, this webinar will be recorded and we will be posting it. Thanks again, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks for your time, guys. Good luck.